Winter 1943, outside Stalingrad. A Soviet reconnaissance squad moves through the snow-covered forest, their breath visible in the -20-degree air. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov raises his hand, signaling a halt. Through the trees, a German position appears deceptively quiet. At just 300 yards distance, what looks like an ordinary machine gun nest sits abandoned. Volkov motions for 2 men to flank left while he and 3 others approach directly. They've covered 50 yards when the silence shatters. A sound unlike any weapon they've heard tears through the forest, a ripping fabric of noise at 1,500 rounds per minute. In just 3 seconds, 45 7.92mm projectiles stitch across their path. Volkov watches in horror as his 2 flanking soldiers collapse without time to scream. The MG42 has just announced its presence with a casualty rate of 67% in the first burst. This was not merely a machine gun, it was an auditory weapon system designed to break human will before the bullets found their mark. This was the Maschinengewehr 42, or MG42. It fired at 12 to 1,500 rounds per minute, twice as fast as any Allied machine gun, and it forced Soviet infantry to develop entirely new assault tactics or face annihilation. The problem for Soviet forces was brutally simple. By 1943, German defensive tactics had evolved into layered killing zones where machine guns formed the backbone of every position. Where Soviet DP-28 machine guns could manage only 600 rounds per minute, German positions could deliver overwhelming fire density that made frontal assaults suicidal. Soviet infantry training based on the deep battle doctrine emphasized overwhelming numerical advantage and momentum, but against MG42 positions, numbers became liabilities. A standard Soviet rifle battalion of nearly 900 men might be held in check by a single company of Germans equipped with a dozen MG42s. The psychological impact was measurable. Soviet after-action reports from 1943 show a 43% increase in combat stress reactions when MG42 fire was identified compared to other German weapons. At typical engagement distances of 3 to 500 yards, the MG42's high-velocity 7.92mm rounds remained lethal, penetrating the standard Soviet steel helmet at 400 yards and punching through light cover that stopped lesser weapons. The Soviets' own primary machine gun, the PM M1910 Maxim, was a water-cooled monster weighing nearly 65 kilograms with its carriage and required a crew of 6 to move and operate. It was stable but immobile, a relic of the First World War utterly unsuited for the fluid, defensive battles of 1943. The DP-28 was more mobile, but its Pan magazine held only 47 rounds, and its rate of fire was simply insufficient for suppressing the massed infantry assaults the Red Army favored. The MG42 made Soviet doctrine obsolete overnight. The engineering constraints were formidable. German designers faced an impossible triangle: reliability in extreme conditions like the Russian winter, unprecedented rate of fire, and mass producibility with limited strategic materials. Previous machine guns like the MG34 were mechanically complex, requiring 900 man-hours to produce and 40 kilograms of precisely machined steel. The MG42 needed to reduce production time by 70% while doubling the firing rate. The solution involved revolutionary stamped steel construction rather than machining, reducing production to just 75 hours per unit and cutting the required steel from 40 to 27 kilograms. The trade-off came in the barrel system. To sustain such high rates of fire, the MG42 required a quick-change barrel mechanism that could be swapped in under 10 seconds by a trained gunner. This meant carrying additional barrels weighing 1.5 kilograms each, increasing the combat load by nearly 5 kilograms per team. The recoil system presented another compromise. To manage the tremendous firing forces, engineers developed a roller-locked bolt system that absorbed recoil but created a distinctive high-pitched sound that earned the weapon the Soviet nickname Hitler's buzzsaw, an auditory signature that eliminated the element of surprise but delivered psychological terror. The German High Command accepted this trade-off. The weapon's purpose was not stealth, but area denial and psychological shock. The MG42's mechanism was a masterpiece of controlled violence. At its heart was a short recoil, roller-locked bolt system that cycled at such speed that individual shots blended into an uninterrupted roar. When fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together approximately 1 centimeter, after which the bolt carrier continued rearward, camming the locking rollers out of their recesses in the receiver extension and unlocking the bolt. This design allowed the bolt to travel rapidly to the rear, extracting and ejecting the spent cartridge case while compressing two return springs. At 1200 rounds per minute, the entire cycle completed in just 1/20th of a second. The weapon fed from a 50-round belt, but the feed mechanism was a study in violent efficiency. A feed arm on the right side of the weapon, driven by the moving bolt, would pivot down, grab the next cartridge, and whip it into the chamber as the bolt returned forward. The muzzle velocity of the standard SS heavy ball round was approximately 750 meters per second, delivering a devastating 3,000 joules of muzzle energy. The entire system weighed 11.5 kilograms with its bipod, measured 122 centimeters in length, and could be operated by a single gunner, though a standard team consisted of 4 men. The gunner, an assistant gunner who carried ammunition and spare barrels, and 2 riflemen for security. The sights were adjustable to 1,200 meters, though effective range was typically limited to 800 meters against point targets and 1,000 meters against area targets. Now, before we get into what replaced it on the Soviet side, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the engineering that shaped history, right back to the MG42. The MG42 emerged from Germany's Grossfuss company in 1941, with design led by Dr. Werner Gruner of Johannes Grossfuss AG. What made this organization remarkable was its background as a metal stamping company rather than a traditional arms manufacturer. This expertise in sheet metal stamping directly influenced the revolutionary manufacturing approach. The German Ordnance Office had specific requirements: increase production rates while reducing machine time and strategic materials. They wanted a weapon that could be produced in conquered territories with limited industrial infrastructure. By 1942, 3 major manufacturers, Grossfuss, Mauser, and Gustloff, were producing MG42s at a combined rate of 15,000 units monthly, a number that would rise to over 20,000 by 1944. The weapon's design reflected Germany's strategic situation by 1942. Fighting a multi-front war against numerically superior enemies required weapons that could multiply the effectiveness of each soldier. The MG42 wasn't just another infantry weapon. It was a force multiplier designed to compensate for Germany's declining manpower through superior firepower. Field units received their first examples in late 1942, with priority given to units on the Eastern Front, where Soviet human wave tactics demanded extreme defensive firepower. Training schools were established behind the lines to drill crews on the specific skills needed: rapid barrel changes, controlled bursts, and coordinated fire with other teams. The first major combat test came during Operation Citadel at Kursk in July 1943. A German defensive position centered around 3 MG42s held off an entire Soviet battalion for over 6 hours. The after-action report, filed by Oberleutnant Hans Keller of the 198th Infantry Division, described how the high rate of fire created a wall of lead that prevented Soviet infantry from closing within 200 meters. The psychological impact was evident in captured Soviet soldiers who described the sound as terrifying beyond description and admitted that units would sometimes refuse to advance when they identified the distinctive MG42 fire pattern. Another proof moment came during the defense of the Dnieper River in September 1943, where a single MG42 team reportedly inflicted over 200 casualties on a Soviet assault force attempting to cross at one point. The German command quickly recognized that the weapon's value extended beyond its killing power to its psychological effect on Soviet troops, who began developing specific tactics to counter MG42 positions. This included using snipers to specifically target the gunner and assistant gunner, employing mortars and rocket launchers to saturate the position before an assault, and training sappers to crawl forward with demolition charges to destroy the nest. The Soviets learned that a direct assault was suicide. The MG42 had to be neutralized by indirect fire or stealth before infantry could move forward. Despite its effectiveness, the MG42 had critical limitations. The high rate of fire meant tremendous ammunition consumption at 1,200 rounds per minute. A standard 250-round belt lasted just 12.5 seconds of continuous fire. This logistical burden strained German supply systems, particularly later in the war when ammunition shortages became acute. The weapon's weight, while reasonable for its capabilities, made it difficult to rapidly reposition during fluid combat situations. Soviet forces learned to exploit this by using mortar and artillery fire to suppress MG42 positions while infantry flanked them. The distinctive sound, while psychologically effective, also made MG42 positions easily identifiable, allowing Soviet forces to prioritize them for counter-battery fire from their own artillery and ground attack aircraft like the Ilyushin II Sturmovik, which became adept at spotting and destroying machine gun nests. The quick-change barrel system, while innovative, required training that some units received inadequately, leading to warped barrels and weapons failures. By 1944, German combat reports indicated that approximately 15% of MG42s in the field were non-operational due to improper maintenance or lack of spare parts. Perhaps most critically, the weapon's effectiveness was highly dependent on the skill of its crew. Inexperienced gunners often wasted ammunition through short, ineffective bursts rather than the controlled bursts of 3 to 7 rounds that experienced crews employed to maximize accuracy and conserve ammunition. The MG42 didn't exist in isolation but as part of an integrated German defensive system. It was typically deployed in pairs or triples with overlapping fields of fire, creating killing zones that no infantry could cross without devastating losses. These positions were protected by barbed wire, mines, and often supplemented by mortar and artillery fire pre-registered on likely approach routes. The weapon's psychological impact amplified its physical effect. Soviet soldiers, once they identified MG42 fire, would often freeze or seek cover rather than advancing, making them vulnerable to other weapons. German defensive doctrine emphasized depth, with MG42s forming the backbone of forward positions while heavier weapons provided support from rearward positions. This layered approach meant that even if Soviet forces managed to neutralize forward MG42 positions, they would encounter additional machine gun nests as they advanced deeper into the German defenses. The MG42's high rate of fire also compensated for the declining quality of German troops. As the war progressed, less experienced soldiers could still deliver effective defensive fire with the weapon. It didn't win alone. It filled a gap in Germany's defensive strategy that became increasingly critical as their offensive capability diminished and they were forced onto a war of attrition they could not win. Today, over 400,000 MG42s were produced by 1945, with variants continuing in service for decades after the war. The weapon's direct descendants, including the German MG3 and Swiss MG51, remain in service worldwide, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. The MG42 proved that industrial design could overcome tactical disadvantages, that engineering innovation could multiply combat effectiveness, and that psychological factors were as important as physical ones in warfare. Its legacy is visible in every modern machine gun that prioritizes high rates of fire and quick-change barrels. The Soviets' hatred of the MG42 wasn't merely about casualties, it was about facing a weapon that rendered their numerical advantage meaningless and forced a complete rethinking of their infantry tactics. It was a weapon that forced an entire military to adapt, to innovate, or to be destroyed. In the calculus of war, the MG42 represented German engineering at its most pragmatic, a weapon designed not for glory, but for killing efficiently, relentlessly, and terrifyingly. War has no respect for fairness, only for effectiveness.